Is every Christian living and working in another country a tent maker? In this section, the panel discusses the need for clarifying the definition and the purpose of tent making.
Christy, why don't you start off right away with the definition of tent making? I think this is very necessary because of the various readings and the statements that I've heard by other missionaries. They use terms like bivocational missionary, self-supporting missionary, just a missionary, if there is such a thing as just a missionary, a lay missionary, non-professional missionary. Christy, what is the definition of a tent maker?
I believe, Brian, that a very fine definition was put together by mission executives who met in January of 1988. And they have stated it this way: tent makers are Christian witnesses from any nation who, because of their skills or expertise, gain access and maintain themselves in another culture with the primary intention of making disciples for Christ Jesus, and, where possible, to establish and strengthen churches. They then go on to add, tent makers support themselves wholly or in part through involvement in such activities as business and commerce, education, research, government service, or ministries of compassion. These ministries may include medical, relief, or development programs. So this is a definition that came up from different mission executives who also saw the need, as you mentioned, to be more specific about just who a tent maker is. Now, I have a couple of suggestions regarding this. If you'd like to hear those, I'd be happy to comment.
Please.
On the one hand, they mention here that they try to establish and strengthen churches where possible. I believe we should take that out. I believe it should be the primary intention of making disciples for Jesus Christ and of establishing and strengthening churches. That should be the goal if we are going to evangelize the world. Also, in relation to this definition, they do not have a place for students, Christian students, who go abroad and enroll in universities in order to witness for Christ. And therefore, I would like to see that added to this. Otherwise, I think this is a very good statement.
You're qualifying it then, the second part of it particularly. What about this question of these ministries may include medical relief or development programs? Do those not already exist in mission programs?
They do exist with mission programs, but many of them exist with international organizations which are not Christian and are not therefore considered mission programs, such as the United Nations, Care Medical, USAID, for example, and other programs have medical relief and development ministries, and therefore tent makers can work with those programs as well as missionaries, as you mentioned, working with them too.
Yes.
I appreciate your clarification, Christy, because it seems to me that there are two kinds of tent makers. If we say tent maker, we're of course making an analogy with Paul the Apostle, who supported himself periodically as necessary through his occupation as a tent maker. But it seems to me there is some confusion in the minds, especially of young adults who consider this, and not making a distinction between what I call a Pauline-type tent maker and a Priscilla-type tent maker. They were both tent makers, but I think there was a great difference between them. It seems to me that Priscilla was more like just an ordinary layperson. I guess she was a lay woman. And Priscilla and Aquila, their primary role in life was as tent makers. And also they helped Paul, and they helped the church, and they helped Apollos, they helped to teach, like any earnest Christian would. But Paul, on the other hand, was first primarily a pioneer missionary. That was his vocation in life. And he used this other as necessary, and apparently periodically. And I think it would make a great deal of difference in a person thinking in terms of serving Christ as to those who are first and foremost apostolic, pioneer, church planting missionaries who use this tool either to support themselves or to gain entry into a place they could not otherwise enter. And that's why I appreciated your clarification that the goal really is to win people to Christ and to plant the Church of Jesus Christ.
I guess my question here is, how does the tent maker actually start the church? I've had not a lot of experience in the area, but just observation that the tent maker has got an awful lot of responsibility on him in his secular job, his or her secular job, as well as trying to get the language and understanding of the culture, and then the time left over to actually start a church. It just seems to me ambitious to use that type of terminology. A tent maker is going to start a church. Now, Christy gave two illustrations, and I'm not disputing those at all, but I'm wondering if through the world we have many illustrations of actually of tent makers starting churches. What do you all feel about that? I'm back to Christy, I guess, because you made the original thought on that.
In relation to that, I agree that many tent makers have not planted churches. But I believe this brings out the fact that we need to train them in order to do that in church planting. And that comes back to our seminaries, our Bible colleges, our Christian schools. That's where we need to begin in training them to plant churches just the way regular missionaries have planted churches. Granted, they have a job to take care of, but look at the Apostle Paul. He evangelized the whole Roman world. And yet, as he said, his hands, as he pointed them out this way to the Ephesian elders, he said, "These hands have supplied my needs and the needs of those with me." And he said he worked day and night in order to earn his living and the support of the team. So I believe it's a matter of training tent makers how to do this. But I do agree with you that it's rare so far, and yet it should be done.
The term tent making is imaginative. It captures the attention of increasing numbers of young adults. And it's a good concept, and it's a good term. So I'm not suggesting we get rid of it. But if we don't begin with definitions, clear definitions, as a bivocational missionary and an earnest Christian layperson, if we don't make those distinctions, it will affect the training that a person seeks, the connections that a person is willing to have, the accountability that a person with. If he is first and foremost a missionary, then he's not going to resent getting the training, both the biblical theological training and the skills training in evangelism and church planting and the cross-cultural skills and the language. If he's really serious about being a missionary cross-cultural, he's going to do all those things. And that's entirely different from the person who's going out just with what he has as a lay person. And I would hope that there are several 100,000 evangelical lay people around the world who are faithful in their witness. And if there's a church nearby, that they will support that church. But I think that definition is all important. And I'm not sure that bivocational missionary is the correct technical term for what we popularly call a tent maker, the kind of tent maker we're talking about. Do you know a better one, Christy? A better definition?
One might be a self-supporting witness in the sense of being a self-supporting missionary.
But now those are the two things that I guess, what you just said, I would like to split them. And I think if we don't split them, we're going to have continued confusion and a much lesser impact than we might have if we'd say a self-supporting missionary and a self-supporting witness. Were you making a distinction there?
I think there is a distinction.
Oh, I see. Good.
Yes.
Well, then we're together on that.
Tent makers are relatively new players in global mission strategy. What is their relationship to career missionaries and established agencies? What motivates people toward tent making? The panel discusses questions related to the need for and the role of tent making.
I would like to ask a question about whether we need tent makers today. Is there a need for more people called tent makers to be out? Robertson, is there, and why?
Well, I think there certainly is. There are many places that a person cannot enter as a traditional missionary or some sort of religious vocation, but the person can enter with some particular skill that that nation or area of the world needs and is interested in having. So this is a wonderful opportunity to get into otherwise closed countries. So I think that is important. Motivation would have something to do with it. I think the popularity of the concept of tent making is enhanced by several other factors which I would hope were extraneous. I think some people are going into it because in the non-denominational mission groups, a person is responsible to raise his own support. And it is much more a cool thing to be a professional than to be an old-fashioned missionary, and especially if you can bypass this whole question of what would be considered begging or relying on other people, which, if that is the motivation, I really feel that we're missing the mark. I don't know how Christy feels about that.
I agree with you that we in no way in tent making should belittle what missionaries have done. God has used missionaries or fully supported witnesses in a mighty way, and tent making should be supplemental and not a critical matter in relation to the wonderful work that missionaries have done. We need more missionaries, but also we need tent makers to go along with them.
Sometimes, though, Christy, I wonder if that point's being made. It seems that in some circles today in missions that is so emphasized. That means the tent making kind of just comes, it has precedence, comes up to front line. And with that comes quite a heavy criticism of the established missionary enterprise. And I guess I would agree exactly with what you said. But I somehow feel that out there, and even in church representation, we are hearing some ideas that seem to promote this is the way for now, and that the old way of doing missions is really out. And that's what I would protest, I guess.
Well, I think you're right. Some people go too far. But I don't agree with them. I agree with you that missionaries and tent makers should cooperate fully in relation to the evangelization of the world. And one thing that is helping promote this is to get more mission agencies to have tent-making branches. So within the same agency, you have both tent makers and you have fully supported missionaries. And I think it's a matter of cooperation rather than competition.
Has not the whole question of tent-making missionaries arisen in some measure by crises in missionary societies and their approach to raising funds, the declining dollar, restricted countries, passport difficulties? Is it not true to say, Phil, that we have to find other ways of getting the message out and reaching the masses with the gospel?
Absolutely. My basic thesis and position is that if the country is wide open to the gospel, then we should move in with missionaries who can give full time and effort and energies to language and culture and really getting on with the job of evangelism full time. As long as those countries are open, we should really be pressing in as much personnel and staff as we possibly can. And I think in reality we should be emphasizing in missions those countries, those difficult countries that may close at any time. And then once any country closes, then tent making and student type entree is the obvious way to go, and I fully support it.
Yes. I think I'd like to qualify as well, Christy, what we mean by closed. It is closed to full-time missionaries, professional missionaries, if we can use those terms. But they're not closed to the gospel and to the good news. I would also like to come back to you, Robertson, because I think you were making a very important point about why people go out as tent-making missionaries. And the thought I had was to do with those maverick-type people that America produces, the independent streak, the individualism that has gone mad.
I thought that was Irish.
No, it's not Irish, but I come back to individualism in America, and it seems to me that this would appeal to mavericks, people who do want to go the traditional route with mission societies, who don't want to have the effort of raising funds. In other words, the motivation sometimes would be suspect. Would you like to address that, any of you? Does it attract that type of person?
Accountability is another word you left out in what you were just describing, which is a very good and interesting description of some people. Now I would like to put that category of people you just described in a very lesser category numerically. But I would like to throw in the word accountability. There are many people that say, hey, I do not want to be accountable to mission structures, mission organizations. It just doesn't look like my thing. And if I can get out in either personal business or student, that gives maximum free flow for individual free spirits. And we got an awful lot of those around these days. And I am a little concerned when, say, a tent maker links up with his church back in a homeland and goes out, and then he fits into this category of kind of free spirit, and where in reality that person needs a great deal of accountability. And so that whole procedure is short-circuited, and I am concerned about that a bit with some people.
I agree with Phil in regard to this, because it is true that Americans have the idea of being a lone ranger. And yet, you look at the biblical model of the Apostle Paul, he constantly had a team with him, and therefore was working with a team. And this is so important if tent making is to be successful, and one reason it hasn't been is the lack of cooperation between tent makers, the lack of cooperation with the mission agency, the lack of cooperation with missionaries on the field. So I believe we really need to emphasize this fact that we're in the work together for the Lord if the world is to be evangelized.
In the third section, the panel discusses what most mission experts believe to be the key issue in tent making: preparation. How much and what kind of training is necessary? What is the role of the local church and the mission agency in the preparation of tent makers?
In what sense is the person to be equipped for tent making vocationally as well as spiritually?
If my distinction within the general category of tent maker is legitimate, then I would say that a person who is a Pauline-type tent maker, a church-planted pioneer, should have the same training that the full-time missionary would have. When you introduce the team concept, then you're thinking of several people who might not have all of that background, training, and skills, who would work together on the team in any given place.
But they could have, right? I mean, they could all be equally
It would be great.
qualified.
It would be great if they would.
That's what I was trying to get around to. That's exactly the point.
It concerns me that I know of even groups that are sending out tent makers
Yes.
in differing conglomerates of how many people go to where, etc. But they don't seem to be emphasizing this enough. In other words, okay, he's a civil engineer, so he can form part of the team, even though, as Robertson's brought out, it's the Pauline model. It's to be really out there full time. But it seems to me that for expediency of getting them out as quickly as possible and functional, that perhaps they're undercutting this whole process. I think this is what Christy's saying. That, in fact, I was surprised to hear Christy say one thing, that it's not been as successful as it should be, tent making as a whole. And I think certainly this is really the area that this is a nerve center of what we're talking about. It has not been as successful and continues not to be as successful as it can be, as it carries with it the potential of being, in large part simply because of this lack of training.
Or lack of reporting and accountability. It may be very successful, or it may be more successful than we know, but we don't hear about it very much. People who are out doing their thing, they could be relatively successful, but we don't hear about it. Christy?
I believe that this brings out the reason to involve local churches with tent makers so that they can pray for them and back them. Even though they don't have to support them financially, they still can support them spiritually. And also getting mission agencies involved, because there you have accountability, and there you have orientation, there you have linguistic training, which they need if they are to be effective, if they are to be church planters. And even when they go into the country, if they have this relationship with a mission agency, they can be visited, they can be advised, they can be helped, and then when they come back, they not only have culture shock when they go into that other country, but they have re-entry shock when they come back. And a mission agency can help them with that. It can debrief them, can use them in the matter of recruiting other tent makers, and therefore I feel it's essential for tent makers to be linked with a local church and also linked with a mission agency.
Okay, I'd like to piggyback on that to really give it some, to authenticate what he says by my own personal observations, that where the mission has both. I really appreciate that point. The regular career missionaries, and if it's possible, now of course sometimes this is not possible at all, but perhaps the career missionaries have been in place, no longer visas are being granted, so now the new wave is to bring in the tent maker. But where both can coexist in the same country even, under the same mission, it just promotes a great spirit of helps to each other, and I just think it makes the whole thing more efficient, and I'm very much in favor of that.
I would like to speak about the main purpose of tent making: soul winning, winning men and women for Jesus Christ. And ask you to address this question: should this gift, this discipline, not be exercised at home before we start thinking about cross-cultural activity? I suppose I could apply the same question to small cell groups or Bible study groups. If this type of effort isn't exhibited at home, what makes us think that they'll do that when they go to another culture, Robertson?
I agree with the implication of your question. It's not likely to happen just because a person moves out into another culture. I suppose historically it has occasionally happened, but it's not ordinary. And I guess that's part of the whole question of accountability, of training, of purpose, of strategy. It all ties in, I believe, with people who are focused from the very beginning on getting the task done. What you started out with. What is our task? Win people to Christ, to establish His church, to build the church in the unreached, the currently out of reach areas of the world, what I call the dark half of the world. That's the purpose. And if that's the strategy and the plan, then people who are concerned with that strategize along with those who know more than an individual might know, those who would have other resources, such as a mission, on the best way to get into a particular country.
Okay, now I'd like to be specific so we can generalize very easily, but what about a seminary? Because we are talking graduate level. These tent makers have usually done their undergrad in secular fields. What about a seminary? Robertson, you're a president of one, having a one-year course that is dedicated simply to this area. It is a tent maker one-year course, and you deal with all of these issues, and also has a practical component to get people out into the scene, and it has some, you could kind of spin off some of the other courses in your curriculum, like if they're going to a Muslim country, you have a course on Islam, or whatever. But do you know, like Christy, you've been around in this area, this is your area of particular emphasis, do you know of any seminary or graduate school Christian that is has a one-year or whatever course for tent makers?
I only have one course in tent making, and I believe you're right. We need to focus more on this. And I agree with you, Brian. The essential talent is leading people to Christ. Our Lord, when he called his disciples, said, "Follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men and of women." And that's what he trained them to do. But I was at the North American Congress on Evangelism 1969 in Minneapolis and attended a meeting of over 600 ministers. Dr. James Kennedy was leading it. And he asked which ministers, either in Bible school, a Christian college, or a seminary, had been trained in how to lead someone to Christ. And only 3 hands went up out of over 600 ministers. And he said, "See, we have taught very important things, but we've left out the most important." And that, I agree, is vital. And you're a professor of evangelism, so I know you're sold on this.
Yes.
And I think it's so important that all evangelical seminaries, Bible schools, Christian colleges teach how to lead people to Christ, because that's what we need to do here at home and abroad, and not only lead them to Christ, but also disciple them.
You couldn't make him any happier because that's the song he sings. I
The Lord happy too.
I agree. Phil, I just could hardly wait for you to ask the question you asked. Yes, I know a school that pioneered this perhaps 15 years ago. A one-year program which includes the basics in Bible and theology and missions and practical experience and training in soul winning and evangelism. And it's a one-year certificate program in which we constantly have doctors and lawyers and nurses and school teachers and so forth involved. Very important. However, the question I want to ask you is this. If the SIM were going to send as a pioneer evangelistic church-starting apostolic missionary, excuse all the adjectives, but that's how you define what you're talking about, they would want them to take at least the master's MA program and probably an MDiv, 3-year program, in order to be equipped to do that. Now my question is, can a one-year add-on be sufficient for this type of work that we're talking about?
Okay, the answer is no, but the answer is something is better than nothing. And it just seems to me that even agencies and individuals are moving out in mass without that at all, and not even a year.
But you know what I discovered? And I've just last week in Africa where I met lots of short-termers. People want to get on with the task and really feel that life is too short to stop and study the basics.
Right.
And everybody's an expert in religion anyway, so why bother? Why take the time to do that?
I see this so much with young people today. They feel they don't have time. And I tell them, your time of preparation can be the most effective ministry that you have in your life. Because while you're training with others, you can recruit others to be tent makers or missionaries, and each one that you recruit, thereby you double your own life. Furthermore, by going to graduate school, seminary, Bible college, you have an opportunity of associating with other Christians who will be leaders. And thereby, by your praying for them, by your helping them, your effect in their lives can be multiplied for the Lord. And so I think they shouldn't look on the time of preparation as simply getting ready.
Amen.
They should look on it as ministry, a time when, as the Bible says, if we don't sharpen the axe, we have to work harder. But if we take time to sharpen the axe, then it's able to accomplish all the more.
If tent making is to become truly viable as a strategy for worldwide evangelization, the deployment of tent makers must be planned and coordinated with more precision. The panel addresses the critical need of strategic planning for tent making.
Ralph Winter, at least, is on record of saying that many, many mission societies are utilizing their personnel as tent makers, and that it isn't given the publicity that this tent-making new wave is, seeming seemingly.
I think there's another thing. If you link up with a mission organization, and that has to do with strategy. I find a lot of young adults actually get their guidance into their vocation in terms of a wholly secular occupational profile, preference scales, and they get into a particular occupation, and then they bring this occupation and say, how can this be used? For that kind of person, we need a very broad strategy, and of course there are organizations that help spot a person. But if there is an initiative taken by a mission or a group of missions to say, we need these particular tent makers to get into this particular critical area. And another part of the strategy would be not only which occupations will open the door, which are needed by the people so that we can minister in the name of Christ according to people's needs, but also if you're really going to be a Pauline type tent maker, it has to be an occupation that will not absorb all of the person's energies and time, which is often the case in the foreign culture. And therefore, strategic thinking would not only deal with the question as to what is the key that will unlock that particular door, but also the question of what occupations fit best with this whole role of tent making. For example, medical work, in many cases, is a very natural vehicle in which a person can help the whole sick person, his body and his spirit, and there can be a spiritual witness. I'm sure we've all seen some very exciting examples of mission hospitals, for example, that are greatly used in this area, as there are others who are not aiming in that direction and don't accomplish the evangelistic task. Teaching English, I guess, is the big one, which is a strategic approach in which a person his vocation is talking. Well, what better way to communicate than to spend your time talking? Also, it seems to be one that permits more flexibility for the person who is a teacher. So I'm thinking now, your emphasis on linking up with a mission or with some responsible organization might help us to think more strategically in this area.
Christy, let me ask you, I certainly look to you as the leading proponent and successful person really pushing tent making through your book and through your presence in varied places. Do you feel that there's been enough strategic planning, as Robertson's brought out, on the part of tent makers, either in mission organization or outside of mission organization? What's your experience as you've been around and talked to people in this area?
Phil, I don't think there has been enough strategic planning. One reason has been that tent making has been suspect on the part of mission leaders. They thought it was just another fad that was coming along. But now they are realizing that this is the main way to get into countries which have restricted access to missionaries. And one thing that has really opened this wide is the situation in China, where missionaries who are fully supported are not allowed the way they used to be, but tent makers are welcomed. And yet, I agree with you, Phil, that there's a great need to have strategy in relation to this. And here again, it's not only tent makers being alone not being effective, but they have not had the backing of mission agencies or missiologists planning the strategy that they are to use. And I think there's a great area that needs to be done in relation to research, in relation to the point which you made, Brian, namely the theology of work, which brings in tent making. And this field, I believe, is just beginning. We're just scratching the surface. And so there's a great deal that needs to be done in relation to strategy, as you mentioned.
So like there almost needs to be a missiological discipline for tent makers type of thing.
I believe
and to really
so.
dig in.
I believe so.
And consider the different areas of the world where the possibilities are, and to get into strategizing, have some think tanks going, bring this into seminaries, and get this thing to really come alive and do it right. Is that what we're saying?
I believe so, because it's exciting to see the new developments in this area. Just in the last few days, I heard of a mission that is being involved in focusing on large unreached peoples groups that are in restricted areas, and they are sending what they call non-resident missionaries, which in a sense are a type of tent maker who go in, say, as a tourist. And yet they are focusing on these groups. They're learning the language, they're learning the culture in order with the purpose of planting an evangelical church in that group that doesn't have one as yet. And so in the whole area of tent making, there are tremendous opportunities, but we do need to strategize.
Is it ethical for a tent maker to enter a host country with a hidden agenda of evangelism? If confronted with social injustice or political unrest, is it ethical to become involved? The panel suggests guidelines for dealing with ethical issues in tent making.
In restricted areas, Muslim countries we're talking about then, there is this question of ethics about going in and being a tent maker, but the primary thing is to win people to Christ. And I remember you came across very, very forcefully on that issue and your own feeling about that. What we're finding now in Muslim publications is they are really big on identifying tent makers as people to watch out for. You know, they're the subversives. They have come in with a second agenda, which is actually a primary agenda. And I just would like, I think for this type of discussion, it would be very helpful, because we did bring up the word resistant, for Christy just to comment on this whole area. When you're going into X country in the Middle East, it's Muslim, it's closed to the gospel, and primary motivation is present Jesus Christ. And the country that hires you to do a secular job and really doesn't expect or want propagation. So we're talking about the word proclamation or propagation, or persuasion too. All these things come in together. Now, Christy, would you address that issue a bit?
I think you've hit on a very important subject. It's true that Muslims don't want tent makers who are Christians, but in reality, Islam has spread with tent makers. The main Muslim missionaries here in North America are the Muslim students. They establish the mosques. They get the money from Saudi Arabia. I attended one mosque in Michigan, in East Lansing, and asked the mullah in charge about his congregation. He said they had 1,000 members, of whom 750 were students from Michigan State. And then he said there were 150 who were refugees who had come in, making 900, and 100 were American Christians, nominal Christians, who had converted to Islam. So you see, Islam has been using tent making to spread their religion, and it's no wonder that they can see about this. Although I was reading in a Muslim publication recently, and they said we must be careful of those people who make tents. In other words, they didn't understand the terminology because it is biblical, and I was glad that they didn't understand the terminology. But you're right, they are opposed to this, of course. They can see that tent makers are successful in Muslim countries, and therefore they are doing their best to try to discourage it. But on the other hand, these countries are so anxious to get help in development, and they think all Westerners are Christians. They don't know the difference between a born-again Christian and just a nominal Christian. And therefore, by having Westerners come into their country to help them with development, they will receive tent makers, and this still is a great opportunity, even though their publications warn against it.
Maybe, Robertson, you would like to comment on something that we just touched on, and I thought, Phil, this was going to be your question. It's to do with operating in a closed community and the politics of that closed community. Does the tent maker make a political statement by just being there, or should he refrain from any activity whatsoever? What is his position with regard to the rules, the regulations, the law? What would you think about that?
Well, I guess the same thing could be asked of any missionary or expatriate who goes to a country. Surely there is some political statement by being an American. Our witness in Japan was greatly curtailed because of the Vietnam conflict, on which the Japanese view was considerably different from the American view. And so I guess it is a political statement. My personal conviction is that all of us, as guests of another nation, should not become involved in issues that are domestic, that are political. I had an uncle who was killed in missionary endeavor, reputedly because he was involved in advocacy. Of course, I'm proud of him, but on the other hand, was that the right thing to do? Or should he have stayed with his testimony, his witness, his raising up of the Church of Jesus Christ? And I guess I would vote for that. That's the way we operated.
The tent maker probably gets pushed a little bit more over into the area of political advocacy or otherwise, more so than even the missionary, the professional so-called missionary. It just seems that when they have a secular role within, say, the government or training programs or something, they just seem to be pushed a little bit more in that direction.
And by definition, he is often the only one who's going to get into restricted countries. But I'm talking about the ethics now, Christy, about in a country that forbids this type of activity. What is the Christian to do, the tent maker who's out there, whose primary purpose is to win souls and plant the church?
Brian, you've put your finger on a very important point. I believe, as our Lord said, we're to render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but unto God the things that are God's. And in relation to worldwide evangelization, in relation to leading people to Christ, our Lord has given us the order, and that comes first. On the other hand, even as Robertson mentioned, I believe that we should live under the laws of the country where they do not conflict with the laws of God. And for that reason, there are difficult decisions that one has to make in relation to witnessing to people when you know that it's against the government or against the local religion. But I believe, as Peter said, is it right to listen to God more than to you? And there are times when we need to do what God would have us do in spite of the consequences, because we need to be loyal to the Lord, first of all. And I believe his laws, as revealed in the Scriptures, come first. Therefore, I would say, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but render unto God the things that are
Well, how about giving us some specifics? Suppose there's a liberation movement.
Well, there again,
Freedom, and it's a very oppressive country. It's very, there are no freedoms. It's, does the foreigner take an advocacy position in this?
there again, I think we need to realize that we're guests of the country and need to be very careful. Now, I know some missions have been criticized for not opposing the oppressive government. But they have answered, look, we are not members of that country. We're not citizens. We're guests. And I think that is important. And yet, by translating the Bible, by sharing the gospel, that is the way to overcome these difficulties and oppression, I believe, not taking an active role in liberation of a country, as you mentioned.
I think that there are times just verbal advocacy is very helpful as bridging into hearts. I think in one particular country that missionaries just listen to the oppressed people and they say, wow, I can really understand where you're coming from, and it's terrible what you're going through, and just that much, nothing more than that, has been kind of a bridge into hearts, and has been very important if they are to work among those people, the suppressed people of that society or that country. They have to take that advocacy, but it's only verbal, it's not active.
Issues related to tent making do exist, but so do countries closed to traditional strategies for sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ. Should we not, then, work together to face the issues in light of our Lord's words in Matthew 9:37 through 38? The harvest is indeed abundant, but the workers are few. Therefore, pray the Lord of the harvest that he may send out workers into his harvest.